evening, everybody. I see a few very familiar faces. Okay, so I know it's a tight hour, so maybe we'll go ahead and get started, knowing that people will continue to kind of call in during this time. Okay, so I'll just kick us off. So good evening and welcome to tonight's STEM report titled Creating and Building Innovative Biotech Companies. So before we get started, I'm going to do the Zoom etiquette. I would like to ask everyone, it seems like everybody already has, but I'm going to ask everybody to mute their microphone and please stay muted, as we'll not be taking any questions live during the panel discussion. But please feel free to type in your questions at the chat function at the bottom of the Zoom screen, and I'll try to answer we'll try to answer some of your questions during the session. So my name is Anna Berry. I'm currently the Chief Legal Officer and Head of Corporate Strategy at a biotech company called Coral Bio here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I'm here with the two very distinguished panelists, John Evans, CEO of Beam Therapeutics, and Eddie Martucci, CEO of Akili Interactive. So I have been working in the life sciences industry for over 20 years and have witnessed some of the incredible advances over the years. And the industry has created companies that can translate the scientific innovation into life-altering drugs, addressing some of the society's greatest unmet medical needs, as we talk about COVID at this time. So in that context, I'm delighted to welcome our two panelists who will discuss the world of creating and building these innovative biotech companies. So I would like to start out with a short introduction from our panelists. So maybe I'll start with Eddie. Eddie, I'm going to ask you to please tell us about your background, about your company, and your path to becoming the CEO of Akili Interactive.
Sure, I'm happy to. Thanks for having me, and it's good to see all the faces. I like the Zoom setup where it actually feels like there's an audience. So this is better than some things I've been on recently where I'm talking to myself, which no one likes. I certainly don't. So it's good to be here. My background is I have a scientific training. I could take you way back. I grew up in Connecticut. I still live in Boston. I'm a Northeast guy, but I'll spare you those details. And so I have a bachelor's degree from Providence College in biochemistry. And then I continued that in the research world at Yale. So I did in MB&B. I did a Ph.D. in a pharmacology lab, actually doing novel drug design. Was fortunate enough to be connected up with a few folks in the entrepreneurial world who really inspired me to think about the translation of technology. So going from the research world to translating those into products and companies. And so coming out of my PhD, I moved up to Boston, was really fortunate to work for an amazing company called PureTech Health, at the time called PureTech Ventures, which is kind of a hybrid investor and incubator and startup company themselves. And I got the opportunity there to start a handful of novel companies, all startups based on innovative cutting edge science. And so that's really my professional background and expertise, is taking novel innovations and translating them into new products and companies. And so I was fortunate enough to get the chance to cut my teeth starting companies in the PureTech network for a few years. Started a few companies, some of which are dead and some of which are still alive and kicking and doing quite well. And then I founded Akili Interactive with a big vision to create a new category of medicine that's based on experiential technology. And so the short story of what Akili does is, which you'll read in the press, is that we have the first FDA-approved video game treatment in the world, which we're very excited about. That happened in June. It's also now approved in Europe with a CE mark. So it's being prescribed by doctors as we speak for the treatment of ADHD, which we're very excited about. And our vision is really to go beyond that and to expand this treatment modality so that we can have treatments for a number of neurological and cognitive disorders that are working through stimulus and experience and entertainment grade technologies, so that they can be non-invasive when needed. So that's what I do. I founded the company, took over as the founding CEO a few years into the company, and they've decided to keep me around at least up till now. So we'll cross fingers that that continues.
Great, thank you. John?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm John Evans. You know, sort of similar to Eddie, I think, you know, in retrospect, my path seems sort of straightforward, but actually, of course, at the time it was fairly wandering and I had no idea what I was doing. So I started at Yale as an undergrad in the late 90s. I was actually an English major, so liberal arts. I wanted to be a poet. I was also a singer. I was in a cappella groups. And so I was an alley cat and then a whiff. And so when I was a whiff, I took a year off, which was sort of something people were doing. And my parents told me to get a job. And so I got a job as a temp worker at Bayer Pharmaceuticals, which was in West Haven, Connecticut, because that was the biggest nearby corporation. I was just answering phones. And I totally fell in love with it. And so we were working on hemophilia products, and it was just the most amazing thing I'd ever seen. And so rather than go to law school like all of my fellow English majors, I instead decided to go after pharma, and it was really quite surprising. So I went to, from there, I sort of had a long path in life sciences, basically going from big places to smaller places. So that was the second big trend for me. I started out doing big consulting at McKinsey for J&J and Pfizer and Bayer and places like that. Figured out, yes, this life sciences thing is great, but I'm not sure I want to work for a big company. And so I started to pivot towards biotech. And basically every time I got a little bit smaller, I liked it more. And I felt like I was closer to the science, and I could sort of see how the whole picture came together in the company, you know, how the people and culture fit into the science, fit into the business and investment and strategy. And I just loved that. And so I kept going smaller and smaller, having no idea how far that would take me, or you know, what was possible from a leadership perspective. I worked at a medium company called Infinity Pharmaceuticals up in Cambridge. This is like 2006. That was an amazing company and didn't work out from a drugs perspective. Then I worked for a company called Agios, where I was early person there, and running business development and leading some drug development there. I was there for about 8 years, and we actually did get 2 drugs approved for acute leukemia. So that was really satisfying to see. And then from there, I went and helped get Beam started. So at Beam, I was really the first employee. I wasn't a founder. There were some academic founders attached already. But I pretty much came in and helped close the initial license of the technology, get the Series A funded, and then have been building it ever since. It's been about 3.5 years. So I actually feel like I had a fairly steady linear progression, you know, going to smaller and smaller places and taking on bigger responsibility every time, and very much learning the lessons from my last place and applying them at the next place. And that was really important. I could never have gone from where I started in my career to what I'm doing today without those steps in between. Beam Therapeutics is a next generation gene editing company. So I've probably heard of CRISPR by now, a famous gene editing tool. So what CRISPR does is it can search your whole genome, 3 billion letters, and it can identify an address within there, and it can actually target it, which is an amazing, magical thing. But once it gets there, it's got a fairly blunt trick. It just cuts, all right? So it just sort of scissors the genome open. And that is powerful, but not kind of hard to control. And it turns out it's not very elegant for doing more careful manipulation of the genome to do things like fix mutations, which is what we'd really like to do. And so we at Beam do a next generation version that's called base editing, where we use the CRISPR to target just in exactly the same way. But instead of cutting, we just land there and we use the second sort of domain that we've added to it that literally chemically modifies the DNA letter, the base, from one to another. So we can turn like an A into a G or a C into a T. And that turns out to be the kind of thing you want to do if you want to do things like change a point mutation back to normal. So something like sickle cell anemia, every patient has the same single letter misspelling in their genes. We can go in and turn that one letter to something that's normal. And there are many other genetic diseases like that we're targeting. So really exciting, cutting edge technology. Again, way beyond scientifically where I ever thought I'd be working, but I really have found that I've just loved the science area, and working with brilliant people like Anna and Eddie, every day has just been incredibly exciting. So I think I'm here for good, and it's been really fun so far.
Great. So I always think like both of you have very interesting background and super exciting companies for technologies, but maybe I'll start with a really simple question. I know it sounds simple, but the answer I know is not so simple. So how do you identify or come up with the ideas for creating biotech? I know, Eddie, actually you are a founder, so you're what I consider founder CEO, where John, you clearly say you aren't the founder, like your invention came from maybe academia or it could be other places. But and you guys are both CEO with, again, that background. Can you comment on how the biotech companies are originally created and where those ideas originally come from?
Maybe I'll go first because I think I have the more vanilla answer. Than I'm pretty interested in Eddie's answer on this one. So a lot of time. So I'd say in biotech, like therapeutics, science, biotech, it's a mix of different things. You sometimes will have academic founders who come up with the key idea. And they, of course, are spending their whole careers thinking about some angle of science and making progress. And as they make a key breakthrough, they, more than anyone else in the world, know it's a breakthrough. And so then they raise their hand and say, hey, I've got something really interesting here and we should start a company around it. And some of them are more, professional, regular company founders than others. And so they sort of, have good networks already. The other piece of the puzzle is the VCs, right? So the venture groups are constantly looking for these sorts of things and trying to start things. And particularly in biotech, it really is usually those two together. You don't have what you have in like tech, where you have some, a 23-year-old in their garage just sort of comes up with an idea and bangs it out on a computer over a weekend. You have a startup. I mean, in biotech, you really need pretty heavyweight expertise, academic science, venture funding, a network of people who can come together and have the expertise to make it happen. And so these venture groups kind of curate those ecosystems, and they have entrepreneurs hanging around like I was after my Agios days. I was sort of orbiting this one firm called Arch, and Arch venture funders were talking to David Liu, who was at Harvard, who had this cool technology, base editing, and they had come up with the idea of starting a company around it. And then they, helped me get involved, and then I helped build it. So it's kind of a regular interaction. And if you're interested in this world, you want to get closer to those networks. In the case of base editing itself, the idea was kind of obvious, at least if you listen to my narrative, right? I mean, you had these tools that were powerful in CRISPR, but leaving a lot to be desired. And that's really the signal to say, can't we do something better? And then, pretty clearly, if you get a better gene editing system, there's going to be a lot of excitement to fund it. So it doesn't take long to figure out that should be a company.
Yeah, my answer is largely similar to John's. It's probably because coming from the life science and medical technology world, it does start with the science. It starts with new research findings and aha moments that neither John or I come up with, and we look to really amazing people who have spent their careers doing that. The only, I guess, addition I'd add, and I wasn't sure you were going to go there, but you did anyways, John. But so it's kind of more a highlight on what you said, is I come from obviously what Akili does, and then a few of the companies I founded before were really trying to create brand new treatment modalities, and a lot of times using technology. And so there is a little bit of a futuristic component to it. So thinking, and so what that leads you to say is, okay, where is the science today? And this is how I think about new ideas. Where is the science today? And what is a trend that's happening in the world, but with a major gap? And it's interesting that from my point of view, that was very much consumer technology. Is a trend that's happening is consumer technology was moving into medicine, but it wasn't becoming the medicine. It was moving really close to medicine, but it actually wasn't doing anything to make the medicine better fundamentally. And that's what we saw as the gap. And we said, there's enough amazing science out there that we finally can leverage it. So that's how this come together. But it was really interesting for me to hear, John, because what you said was basically the same thing, right? Is that there's amazing new science around gene editing. That's the trend. There, hundreds of millions and probably billions of dollars flowing into the gene editing field. But you can see the clear gap. So I guess the trend with a gap, and then some bedrock science. For me, that's where the most exciting new companies tend to form in life sciences, and even in novel technology. The only other piece to highlight is I agree with what you said about kind of spending time in clusters and with people. For my part of where I've been in my career, the last, I guess, decade and a half has been very much spending tons of time with researchers and academics and understanding where those scientific trends are. And you don't necessarily have to do it, but it's one of the coolest parts of my job and career to date is just seeing these amazing ideas that people have spent time researching and unearthing. And those to me are always some of the coolest insights. It's one of those things that it's like that that phrase of it's an overnight success that took 10 years. That tends to be exactly what happens in sciences. And so you're capitalizing and ideally engaging people who have put blood, sweat, tears, and years into technology, and you match that with a trend and a gap, and then you cross your fingers.
Great. So, we just talked about how you create a company, where does your idea come from and what goes into it. So let's maybe start talking about how you build a company. Actually, there are many key components for creating a successful biotech company. And as you just mentioned, a novel technology is kind of essential. I'm going to go into a couple other things. The experience management team, you talked about networking, getting to know a lot of people, hanging around a circle of key advisors or scientists, etc. And clearly, this is a very expensive endeavor. As John mentioned, we can't just pop up a computer and create an app for it, unlikely. So you need a very lot of heavy investing, financing, and supportive investors who will kind of stick with you through ups and downs of the building the company. So I know both your companies are very successful. I know, Eddie, your company's now a commercial stage, which we're going to go into that. I want to talk about kind of different stages of the company. And John, I know your company's also now at this point being so young, over 100 people, and I know you went through a very successful IPO earlier this year. So what do you think are some of the components that contributed to you start building this company early on? Like, what were some of the things beyond technology that both of you have focused on as you start building the company?
I'm happy to start with this one, John, if you want. I think to me the money is an important part, but I probably don't want to spend too much time on that because it's the necessary evil and the boring part. But it's important, and I think the only piece I'd have to say there is I think it's really important for technologies that are not flash in the pan, consumer apps, but that are really trying to do big transformational work, especially in sciences and medicine, that the early investors are long investors. And I think that's really important. I know a lot of colleagues, and I was fortunate to be in an environment that was protected with long investors. But when you see kind of early investors that are really short spec investors, it puts a lot of strain on growing an exceptional company, because there's a pressure every 6 months to think about flipping or maximizing an asset or selling. And that happens a lot to some really, really good ideas and technologies. So that's the only piece I'll say on money, is to the extent, money is always difficult, but to the extent that you can get good bedrock investors who have a long view, that's what building lasting companies takes, I believe, even from the earliest days. My main and only answer really here in the early days of startup is people. And I think about people twofold. People internally, your startup people, and I think it's a really unique set of people in the early days of building a company, who are both skilled and experienced, but are those types that want to roll up their sleeves and do everything. And in my view, that's key. Now, that doesn't work in all areas. You can't hire someone who comes from this field and have them go be a bench scientist doing cell cultures. That doesn't work. But generally, from any specialized field in the early days of startups, you can get people who have deep experience and really love and operate with wearing multiple hats. Because I think in the earliest days, what you're trying to do is accomplish an inordinate amount of work really quickly to generate proof points. So the right types of key internal people, and ideally a couple folks that can be your senior team early days, is I think really transformational. And I've got plenty of lumps and bruises and notes on my wall in my bedroom of how I will do it differently every single time. Just keep learning. But the other people component to me, you mentioned the key word to me, is advisors. Anna, you said advisors, and I'm a huge believer in treating yourself as the, especially founder and early CEO, as the least smart person in the room in all aspects of growing the business, and really tapping into advisor networks as much as you possibly can. So the various companies that I've built, and then Akili is the one that has scaled to the largest, and it's not that big. I think it's smaller than John's company, but to this stage is early on, I have as many advisors as I have employees, and actually probably 2x advisors that I have employees in the early days on all aspects, business and even commercial in the early days, science, medical, because I'm just a huge fan of the wisdom of a diverse set of people who have thought about ideas from different angles. And I just think it builds strength and resilience and creativity when you're in those early chaotic growth days.
Yeah, cool. Very similar answers. I'll try to give some extra flavors. I think definitely the money is important. You can't start anything without that. In biotech, especially in genetic medicine, it's so incredibly capital intensive. You need massive amounts of money forever. So we raised a $90 million Series A. So there's not that many venture groups that can raise that. And frankly, in my sector, that's considered medium now. So we had venture groups, Arch and F Prime, Fidelity's arm for venture, that had very long-term views. I think I agree with Eddie that you really have to be aligned about what you're trying to do. Some groups sell quickly, and that can be a fair goal. It's not a company I want to work for. We want to change the world and build a lasting company and create a sustainable pipeline of new medicines. So that's a 10 to 15 year journey. So money's really important. Partly about the money is having the breadth of potential to justify that kind of investment, right? I mean, if you're just a one program company, that's not going to make sense, right? To put that much money in. So, but for us, we had a platform technology. This could be a whole new class of medicines. We can create, many different programs sustainably. So that's going to be exciting enough for investors to generate sustainable amounts of investment over time. So that's important. The other piece of that is you then eventually have to show progress, and so, resolve that to a pipeline and sort of have some initial demonstration ideas, some proof of concept experiments. So usually investors are looking for that nice combination of a pipeline where you've got some programs that are starting to move forward. They can kind of see where the products might come from. They kind of judge you by your progress. But you also have that platform that means it's more than just those programs, because of course those programs might fail. But you get that extra potential of, something in here will work. And if it does start to work, we can keep doing many more things like this. Far more important than either of those things is people, just as Eddie said. And I think, I think very much that biotech is like an apprentice industry where you can't really learn it from a book or a class. You just kind of have to live it once or twice and see people doing it and see the mistakes that get made and the successes, and you kind of build your own playbook. And so I think a real biotech startup is not for novices. I think you really need people who've been around a couple times at least and have incorporated those lessons. So I consider myself kind of coming from a lineage of, there was Millennium Pharma in the 90s. A bunch of those people ended up at Infinity, where I worked. And then I went over to Agios, which was a Third Rock company, which is also sort of Millennium people. And Agios had a great CEO named David Schenkein. I learned so much from him. He had come from Genentech. And I feel like at Beam every day, I'm just pulling those lessons in, right? And I think that's really critical. So that those early days, I brought a lot of that, but the other key people, it was my head of HR, who I knew had done a lot of Third Rock companies. She had built many companies and knew how to build culture and hire great people. And then we hired a CSO, a Chief Scientific Officer, who actually had been at Big Pharma for a while and then had been at Moderna. So Moderna is sort of famous now. And he actually started their vaccines group, by the way. So we're all thankful for that. But anyway, he brought a lot of that ability to sort of build this complicated genetic medicine infrastructure, which I had no idea what I was doing. And he and I have been just a great partnership ever since. So I think you can't underestimate the value of having experienced leadership. And at Beam, we've scaled so quickly and we're doing so much that we've never made a mistake by hiring too much expertise. Like we always we try to go for like that amazing talent that brings even more to the table than you think you need today. And because we've grown so fast, we've really benefited from that. And then from there, you just try to set up that positive, virtuous cycle in growth where you're getting great people. You work really hard on the culture, really hard on the values of the company. What's the mission? How do you attract really great young talent to want to work there, and just grow? Because it's going to be those people who make or break the success of the company for sure. Whatever your technology or funding situation was, it's going to be the people, especially that first cohort of people that will make or break it.
I mean, I think people is like a resident. We always talk about people is important. Everybody from investors to your management to your advisors, and you just mentioned, once you have the senior level of people, that the people who are actually going to be in the lab and working, right? And both of you guys as a CEO are not in the labs or designing or coding or doing pipetting. But I kind of want to ask this question because there are a number of students who have approached me in the past about, well, how do you get a job at a biotech company? Is there some things, that I should take I get always a question about, do I need to take a class? Do I need an intern? How do I get into this field? And then there are definitely people, some of the alumni who is considering switching and pivoting into biotech. And can you just comment on, or where do you find some of these great people who's going to help you build a company early on or later on?
Yeah, I could riff on that. I mean, I think that part of it is geography, actually. I mean, if you're in Wisconsin, it's going to be hard. If you're in Cambridge, Massachusetts, it's going to be a lot easier. So, and then there's in betweens. There's hubs in New Haven and Philly and New York and other things like that. So a big part of it is just geographic flexibility. Can you get to where the companies are? Because it's still fairly clustered, I would say. After that, I think if you're a scientist, there's a lot of opportunity, really. I mean, the companies are posting all the time. They really need help. Many of them do internships, actually, so you can actually get an internship. And I always laugh, like every single intern or consultant we've ever hired has turned into a full-time employee, because as long as it basically fits and they're good culture drivers and they do the job and you get to know them, it's like, great, this is working, let's keep going. So that can be a great entry point as well. Obviously it depends on your degree level, but there are Ph.D. roles, there are master's level roles, there's even undergrad level roles. It's probably hardest to get into a smaller biotech from an undergrad, but it can be done. On the business side, or if you're kind of pivoting in the middle of your career, that can be, take a little more time and effort. These companies tend to be big on the lab side and then smaller on the business side, and probably on average more senior on the business side. So like, for instance, there's certainly not an undergrad recruiting outside of science in biotech. Even coming out of grad school, like MBA programs, I talked to a lot of MBAs, and it's not completely clear how you go straight from an MBA to a small biotech. Sometimes you can, but you have to get lucky, get the right connections. But going from there to like a consulting firm that maybe does work in biotech or pharma, or going to a medium-sized biotech like a Vertex or an Agios or something like that, and then from there kind of going smaller and smaller. I think those are slightly more steady pathways to get in.
I'd agree with that. I'm a big fan of internships. We use them a lot as well. We've hired from them. I agree that I think roles can be limited, and depending on the cycle and depending on how big and how many biotechs are out there at the time, there may be more or less roles. And so I think having some expertise in either research science or some sort of consulting or strategy roles, quite frankly, and this is like maybe an uncouth answer or something, but it almost doesn't matter where, to some degree. And to the point that you said, John, about biotech being an apprenticeship, I think it also doesn't matter where you start in biotech, frankly. Like working at a small biotech, like, so I've talked to a few people, this always resonates with me. I've talked to a few people who are like, I don't know, I saw these 3 companies, but I'm not really sure. what they are, and I'm not really sure how stable they are. And my advice is always the same: just do it. If you're interested, go apply. Like, don't overthink it, because first of all, small biotechs are not that much less stable than large healthcare companies these days, which are constantly reorging and shutting down businesses. So I think that you can throw out the window. And so that fear of, well, you know, is it going to be legit enough? Is it going to be around long enough? What if it fails? I would actually say, if you're interested, think about the apprenticeship piece and just get in, because I know for a fact when a now more growing startup or growing biotech looks at a resume and you say, oh, great, this person did 2 years. And if they're coming back, it means they like it. They like working in that environment, because these are not, biotechs and startups are not for everyone. Some people love the super structured and super process heavy big companies, and they'll self-select out employees. But if employees have been at a stint in one of these types of companies, and now they're coming passionately to come to another small company, it's usually a massive boost in terms of candidacy. So so I think that's my general thought on it is, you know, kind of not to spray everywhere. That's not the point, but really go, you know, if you're interested in getting in biotech, then get in a biotech. Don't, you know, it's not about finding the perfect one, because you know, you might be looking a long time and roles are going to be limited.
Maybe I'm just going to follow up on a couple of.
Okay, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say just a couple of follow-ups. One, you talked about pharma, and before I get to that, the other one is, you know, I feel like in biotech and Eddie, because just your software, I know you have programmers, which again, people who are thinking about biotech might not be thinking about programmers, but in addition, we have a lot of, I feel like at this point, we amount of data. Yeah. I know we're looking for bioinformaticists, and there are people who are, you know, computer science background if they took some biology, but you know, Eddie, you're even going beyond that with the programming, and again, in a digital therapeutic world. So one, I want to just comment about biotech. Do you agree that maybe you don't have to have biochemistry or biology to go into biotech? There are a number of other areas that you can study that you will pivot into the biotech. And talking about pharma versus biotech, and you mentioned that some of our senior leaders, or not even then, moved from pharma. Certainly I was at Genentech. I spent my time at Genentech and went smaller and smaller, but is there value in spending some time at a larger pharma to prepare yourself to come into the biotech where it's a little more chaotic, but you have some better understanding of maybe how drug development may work?
Yeah, I don't think it hurts. It can help. I'm not a huge proponent though of, I think the growth at large companies can be a lot harder, and the exposure to a variety of fields of whether it's research or management or strategy can just take a lot longer. And I don't know, maybe it's my personality. I like the idea of diving in a fire and getting exposed to lots of things, and then, you know, having a sense of, you get a decent general exposure to lots of areas, and then you see the areas that you really love. So that's, I don't know, that's my reaction to that. But that's not to say against going into larger companies, because I think it's a great path. I think if you have a research background, or you're in a strategy or BD group at a pharma or big medical device company, very often that's great experience that will translate in. I guess my caution is on getting, if you really want to be in the startup biotech, making, not going in the kind of long-term growth route in the big companies. But I think that translates to, you could hear my strategy on this for people is like, do whatever, just get into some areas that could translate in, and then keep your eyes open and talk to people and see what startups are popping up. And then go. It's a not overthink mentality. I do agree with what you're saying, Anna, about the types of science it's really exploding. I mean, my industry, we're one of the founders of the digital therapeutic industry, which is far beyond what we do now. There's a few dozen companies making different types of software interventions, going through clinical trials, FDA processes. We employ, and I know a lot of the other companies in the space are similar now, we actually do employ people who come from hard science. I mean, myself, I come from biochemistry, but we employ people who are biochemists and chemists. We employ neuroscientists, we have cognitive neuroscientists, cognitive psychologists, we have data science people who come purely from data science and CS backgrounds. And so I do think that, and medicine, I'm sure, John, you can speak to it. I'm sure you guys have a massive data heavy component and computational component. So I do think there's a lot of background of, like, you know, whatever you're interested in that is analytical and scientific in nature, my guess is going to translate in the medicine world in the next few years.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean, computational is huge. It's growing massively. We do whole genome sequencing to test for like our on-target and off-target editing. I mean, it's like terabytes, like we're drowning in data. And it's pretty hard to manage, actually. So that's a huge growth area. And there are many other sort of areas like that. So I agree, you have to think holistically about, there are lots of ways in which any skill set is potentially relevant. It's a huge growth industry. In terms of the path in, I think I agree. I'm probably one click more conservative than Eddie. But I also took that slightly more linear path, which makes sense. Where I think a little bit of training at bigger places can be good. It just gives you that kind of framework and orientation, and you build a network, and you kind of know, okay, this company's good, that company's maybe a little sketchy, and that helps sometimes, because Lord knows there's a big Darwinian dispersion in biotech. You know, the best biotech companies are some of the greatest organizations in human history, I believe. And some of the worst biotechs are some of the worst organizations ever as well. So you can run the gamut. So you do want to have some sense of taste, I think. But that said, you don't want to stay too long. And I think, you know, people become kind of lifers in big companies, and it's a great environment. Those big companies are doing big, important things, and someone needs to work there, but it's a very different mode of working than in a startup. A startup is no guidelines. You're making it up every day. You're building the plane while you fly it, is the phrase we constantly use, and it feels really right. And so you just have to get used to that, and you have to find out if you like it. And the sooner you find that out, the better. So I wouldn't stay too long. And I guess the other thing that Eddie said that resonated with me is, a lot of people ask me, you know, how do you deal with the risk of a biotech? And I think I'll just basically give the same answer Eddie did, which is, it just doesn't feel that risky. One is because big companies are disrupted all the time, and there's some risk there. But it's also because it's such a growth industry. I mean, I think if I was in some really arcane corner of a technical field and my one company didn't work out, I wouldn't have a career anymore. That would feel risky. But in biotech, you know, in Cambridge, you throw a rock, there's another company hiring, you know, and the people who work together, who get to know each other, those networks again, you know, they'll work together again and again and again. And if it doesn't work out, everybody's like, okay, it didn't work out. Let's do the next one. So now, you know, the equity might not be worth anything, right? And your business card might change regularly, but from a basic like job security, will I have a salary kind of thing, I don't really worry too much about it, honestly. And I think a lot of people, you know, shouldn't. So it's on that front, I think it's well worth the risk.
I will agree with you on that. There are, at least in the middle of COVID, we seem to have a lot of money for biotech companies. Certainly Coral just also raised $91 million earlier this year. And to your point, 91 million just sounds like middle point. But I think you brought up a point about, you know, this is very heavy capital intensive industry. So as much as you want to bring this 50 or 100 million, that doesn't last too long. I mean, it depends on what your burn is. You looking at a year or two, maybe 3 years before going to raising more money. So certainly there's a private investor who talked about venture capitalists and investors. But I think the other part that all of us kind of sometimes rely on, I know, John, you haven't done it quite yet. So maybe I'll start with Eddie, and I know you can comment on your prior experience, is partnership with pharma. So we talk about maybe not working there, but I think they are part of the ecosystem of a biotech companies on an exit strategy, and we can talk about you exiting through IPO, but certainly, you know, there's this what we call non-dilutive financing through partnership pharma. And I think it's important because they help build a lot of these biotech companies. And there's a flow of technology that can go back and forth, and that could be a really synergistic, nice collaboration to have. So can you both kind of comment on your experience with either your current company or past companies about, you know, working with pharma, how it has been helpful to continue to fund your companies?
Sure, I'm happy to. We've done a couple different interesting partnerships, and we're because we're first in our field, and something that pharma hadn't really partnered with before. It was interesting because a lot of pharmas kind of want to dip their toe in the water, and that was not something. I've been very outspoken about new industries like ours, digital especially, making sure not to mortgage away your future with pharma, because I've seen that happen in kind of fledgling companies in our space, at least. But I think there's a lot of value to be had with incumbent companies in any industry, and in our industry, pharmaceuticals, absolutely. So we've done at Akili, we had a really nice research partnership with Pfizer, where we did work in Alzheimer's early on. It brought in a lot of non-dilutive funding. It proved out a few aspects of our technology on the sensitivity and measurement side. And then we have a commercial partnership for rights in Japan and Taiwan with Shionogi, which is the third largest pharma company in Japan, where I'm proud because they paid for our asset just like you would a molecule in ADHD, which a lot of people said couldn't be done. But really, the way it's done is you hold the line firmly on value. So my philosophy on partnering with incumbent companies is you got to have a really strong anchoring of the value that it brings. And what I think there's always value to be had. And so I'm a big fan of partnering. What I think needs to be differentiated is sometimes in the startup world, in the biotech, the early company world, there's a push to partner for validation that doesn't actually bring value and can be heavily distracting. And so I think an important differentiator is sometimes in the life of a company, validation is actually critical. And so if you're eyes wide open about, I want to partner with this so my name, my company's name gets on the map because, we partnered with Merck or something, that's fine as long as you're going into it eyes wide open. But generally what I like to say is what is the key business value leverage that would be extremely hard to get otherwise, and make sure that's the deal you're driving towards. So hopefully I'm not talking I could go into deep details about the types of deals we have done and haven't done and have walked away from. But that's my kind of like 10,000 foot view context of it, which is there can be a push for early companies to just partner with pharma because of course you should. And I think, John, you guys have a fundamental position on this of owning your assets to a large degree. And we feel the same way, which isn't to say it's an anti-partnering philosophy. It's a really, I guess, rigorous and there's a word I'm missing. I guess it's 8:45 at night. There's a holding the line is the only phrase I could think of, very strongly on the value that you want to get. And only if you get that value do you partner, but it's the value and the need that drives the partnership, not having a partnership that drives the partnership, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's got to be strategic. I think as an entrepreneur, just generally, you have to have a really clear idea of what are you doing, why are you doing it, where you're trying to get to, and what do you need to get there. And just doing a partnership for partnership's sake is not always the right answer. And in fact, people often call it, the non-dilutive partnerships, but of course, actually, it's quite dilutive.
Very dilutive.
Giving away your product, right? Call it differently dilutive. So, the key
and distracting, by the way, dilutive and distracting.
That's right. So you really want to be, that's right. I mean, distracting, you're losing control, you're now running a three-legged race tied to some other company. So it's a whole other ball game. So, but it has a role to play. So we did big deals at Agios. We did a bunch of deals with Celgene. They were quite innovative for their time. Did a $130 million upfront deal in 2010. So this was, still in the biotech nuclear winter. And that was a company saving deal. It allowed us to go broad on many targets. And otherwise, if we didn't have that deal, we would have had to do kind of one or two targets and just been a much smaller company. But maybe that makes sense. I mean, you can only deal with the funding environment you're given. And so in a lean time, you really want to use pharma partnerships. They bring expertise, they bring cash, and we use that at Agios. Then the markets opened up in 2013, and we actually got out and went public, and were quite successful. And they've stayed open. I mean, it's crazy. It's 7 years later, and we're still having companies go public. And there was a long time in 2006, 2008, 2010 area where we thought it was never gonna happen again. And so So now it's a slightly different story. Now I think biotechs have the luxury, frankly, of choosing their path. And there are investors who will invest right up front and along the way. And you really don't need to partner, actually. So you can think more strategically about it. So I think from our perspective at Beam, we've chosen not to partner anything yet because we'd rather keep the value ourselves. We think that investors will reward us for that. And frankly, they kind of prefer it that way in some cases. We will do deals because we can't possibly do everything that's possible with our technology on our own, but it's more scientifically driven. It's, who can help us, with whom can we go faster or do more than we can do ourselves? Great, let's talk about that. But we don't have to do it for funding. And I think, one of the reasons I think it's a great time to be in biotech, with the funding environment we're in, is because it gives the biotechs that leverage to be choosy and to do it on your terms, whereas in 2006, we had GSK doing option-based deals with discovery companies where they'd say, okay, you're in research, here's $5 million up front, and I have an option on your program at phase 2. And it's like, how is that company going to get to phase 2? That's never going to happen, right? And so, those are times when I think biotech is on the edge. Like, it just may not be an industry. But luckily, I think largely through the revolution of genetics, when we're so much smarter about development and the technology is so much better and the probabilities of success have gotten better, I think the investors are kind of figured that out, and it's in kind of a virtuous cycle, and so far so good. And I hope it continues.
Yeah, to hone one of my points on one of John's examples, capital, the exact capital timing can absolutely be strategic, right? That can be something where you say what we need as a company right now is a certain type of capital or a certain type of capital now that we can't access otherwise. And the Agios Celgene deal was something we all still talk about, and a lot of people reference that, right? Because it was a massive deal. It allowed the company to flourish. It was huge. So for Agios and everyone at the time, but that's highly strategic. And so I think it's not a one size fits all approach. But I would say, kind of wrapping to your point at the end now with capital, when capital is flowing, I'd always rather take dilutive equity capital from long investors than I would partnership capital at an early stage, because it will almost always, unless you're, and I'm not, unless you're someone like Stefan at Moderna or some other folks, it will almost always cap the value significantly under what you can build if you have control of an asset long term.
So that we talk about why you would not partner, right? We're talking about you are giving away the value of your asset early. Like earlier you partner, the less money you get, obviously, and the longer you hold on to it, you can partner for a lot more money in a very basic term, because ultimate goal is for us to develop drugs that will get to commercial. That's when you start selling and you can actually start making money. For biotech, it takes 8-10 years from the very early research to get to the product. So it's a long time. I have to say, personally, I've worked at companies as a product. I worked at Genentech and was doing Avastin or early, but I actually never worked at one company where I saw the whole thing through. I think, John, you saw that at Agios, and I have to say congratulations, because you're very few people. And Eddie, for your company, that's why I think it's so rare to have you both here. But you go through these different stages of company. You do discovery, your early stage research, we're developing your platform. Then you go through development. This is where you do clinical trials, cost a lot more money than research. And then you go into commercial. Can you comment on, as you're building the company, because both of you have lived through it, what does the company's need? How does the needs of the company change during this time? I assume there's some component of different people who you need expertise in, say, clinical trial you didn't need before. But in addition to people, what do you think that changes, and how does culture change as the company's growing and maturing?
We're going through it as we speak, and have been for the last 6 months or so, and before our FDA decision. Definitely, you hit on two key ones: people and culture change, right? Sometimes it's really hard. I mean, one of the hardest things for me is as a founder at an early stage, and John, you've been at really early stage and small. Some of the people types and their people's ambitions, some individuals aren't the same at scale that are kind of the ones that will flourish than at the smaller stage. And that's okay. That's not positive or negative. It's just fact. And so the talent base matures over time. You do need, I talked early on about the people being Swiss Army knives and rolling up your sleeves across the business. As you get to a stage like we're a commercial company now, you want people who have highly specialized and a long career in certain areas. And you don't want people who want to come in and roll up their sleeves and touch different parts of the business, because you have things you need to tackle at a later stage of a company. So, and so that changes sometimes the type of people, but it's really important to me, and I think it's something that that startup DNA can help, which is to keep some of the creativity, to keep some of the nimbleness as you scale into this phase. And so it's not I don't ever like to think about it as a wholesale pivot. I think about it as an evolution where you keep a lot of what made you great, but you're really adding certain types of expertise. The culture side is a really interesting one, and it's one we're still grappling with, honestly, where the demands are just different. I mean, as you approach commercial and you're becoming commercial, the demands are now highly execution oriented. And now it's far less about the amazing, cool vision and far more about, okay, is this actually going to work on the market? And are you going to scale this? Is it going to help people? Is it going to make money? And I think with that, again, it doesn't need to be a pivot from the early creative days, but it can be, it can feel straining for an early culture that felt like it had a lot more time. The reality is, when you're in the seats of John and I, it never feels like you have enough time. You're always like pushing to the next milestone, and sense of urgency is always high. But I think for the culture at large, when you're on those early science days and those early trial days, there's a different type of pressure. It's much more flourishing creativity and big ideas, and we're going to see what the data looks like a couple years from now. And that is a very different reality than when you've hit all those proof points. Investors care far less about the big sexy vision. The world out there, all they care about is they need your product now, and so you're accountable to patients. And that's, I think, what for me has helped keep that through line between the early kind of mission driven, super creative, and really highly motivated for the altruism point of a startup, to a slightly more mature startup that's execution oriented. It's keeping the patient in mind. It's keeping in mind, why are we doing this? And in the early days, that it's like, wow, we're going to change the world in the future. And in the days we're in now, it's we have people sitting there who want our product like now, and who are going to expect this to work and help them. And that's what we're delivering toward. But that kind of patient at the center, at Akili, we call it the patient at the table with us. To me, it allows you to have a nice through line and a nice core where the sense of urgency and the pressure actually does change, but that core doesn't have to change. And I actually don't think it should if you're building a long-term great company.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. And I completely agree. I think there's no question growth is like the bad news of biotech success. I mean, it just sucks. Like, it would be great to be a 35-person company forever. And, early stage researchers, they're young, like the energy is incredible. It's flexible and dynamic. You're goofy, culture is really fun. But our mission is to create lifelong cures for patients suffering from serious diseases. You're not going to do that with 30 people. Like that's, the companies we aspire to be, for better or for worse, are 1,000-person companies. I wish it wasn't so. I would love to do this with 200 people even, but unfortunately, I don't think that's the case. So we're 170 now, and growth is forever in front of us. So you go through these sort of shocks, like the first time you're 50 people, first time you're 100 people, first time you had development, right? First time you had manufacturing. We haven't even added commercial yet, but that's a whole other one. Going public, all these regulated things, the public markets, the FDA, like this all changes things, and it gets more complicated and more process heavy. And it's a challenge, and it is hard to deal with. So what you do is, I think you've got to, probably the main thing as a CEO, talk about the role of a CEO. I think I manage my board, I manage my team, my senior team, hiring them, getting them aligned. it's fundraising. We've talked most of the time about fundraising, and then it's people and culture. And it's just, and that last one, it's this every day. It's how do I keep it special? And I think the answer is, it's not going to be that we're still having the happy hour in the same way we were when we were 40 people. That changes. So culture changes, it's dynamic. But what hopefully is, just as Eddie said, what hopefully is consistent is your mission and your values, right? So it's, you're here because you want to use this technology to create lifelong cures. And we have a set of values at Beam. It's fearless innovation, it's rigor and honesty, it's having an open mind and being committed to each other, right? That stuff should scale. And the 1,000th persons we hire at Beam should feel that just as intently and should be able to speak that language with the first person we hired at Beam. And so I think it is possible. Rob asked a question in the chat about, how do we maintain that during the pandemic? I mean, that was yet another curveball. I often joke that I feel like Beam has been a different company every 6 months, and the pandemic was just the latest wrinkle. But what's funny about that is I feel like people at Beam kind of embrace that. It's like change has been kind of a constant. So it's just yet another thing. But we've just gone into overdrive on teamwork and communication. So we do Zooms every week. We do a lot of group activities. We program, we're sending stuff to people's houses, fun kits and stuff like that. I had a 15-minute chat with everybody in the company over the course of 6 weeks or so over the summer. That was an incredible amount of time, but it was really valuable to see where people were at. So, it has been yet another phase, but I think if it isn't a command and control kind of company, if it's more like we're all just aligned on the same place we're going and we're shared values, then it actually is pretty adaptive. And I've been really proud of the way people have reacted.
So maybe just with the last couple minutes, I know I do want to give a couple minutes to YAA to talk about additional programming coming up, but with maybe 30 seconds from each of you, can you comment on just the future of biotech with the COVID coming on? And I assume this will pass, but it's an incredible run that we have had in the last decade or so. Where do you think the future of biotech is going?
I'll go first. I'll let Eddie close. I think this is the biotech century. I really do. I think we are just at the beginning of the inflection point of what's coming, and the stuff that we're doing today and in technology and biology and genetic engineering, things like that, is going to look antiquated in 20 years, I think. So I think we're at that kind of a slope. So I think, and the world, Lord knows, has a lot of need, and it's not just medicine, it's agriculture, it's environment. I mean, there is a ton of need for biotechnology over the next century. So I think it's a really exciting time.
Yeah, I agree. I think the amazing thing is that we're now actually using technology. And by that, I mean like this rapidly advancing technology. We're using it either to develop our products or as the products themselves. And so we're now in a phase, we're not in this long kind of linear phase anymore, where we're using older technologies. We're actually, all biotech businesses now are almost using real-time technologies in development. And so we're on a different part of the curve. And what that's going to enable is, I believe, a new generation of biotech companies that are many things we can't envision today, like literally just a couple of years down the road. We're not talking 20 years because the advancement is happening so quickly. So I think we're going to see an exponential growth in both biotech companies doing the types of things we do and the general types of technologies, products, and human biology we're able to tap into. That's actually going to be amazing.
All right, so I'm going to thank the incredible two panelists who's been very generous with their time on Thursday evening to be with us. I know we are limited time. For those of you who want to get to ask more questions to John, Eddie, or me, we're all on Cross Campus. I'm going to do shout out for Cross Campus. If you're not registered on Cross Campus, please do so. This is where we reach all the students and alumni. And all three of us are available on Cross Campus to be connected and answer any of your questions. All right, I'm going to give the last minute to Jeff Feldman, our committee chair for YAA's committee who's sponsoring this event. Jeff?
Thank you, Anna, and welcome everybody. And this was a great show. You did a great job, and John and Eddie, what a fantastic discussion. I just really got a lot out of it. As Anna said, I co-chair the committee that has developed this platform but it's this great group effort. And we have these shows every Thursday. And I just wanted to put up a screen real quick so people can see what we're doing. We're doing things on the STEM report, which you saw tonight. Next week will be a career pivot show. After that, we have the human experience. We have life and personal growth, and they keep rolling. So I encourage you, even if it's not in your area of expertise, you'll learn something and you'll see other Yaleys. It's really exciting. So every Thursday at 8, it's called Must See Yale. For those old enough, we used to have Must See TV. And here it is. You can see the upcoming episodes for everything we're planning. And it's only as good as our participants. So we really look forward to seeing you. Thank you for being here tonight. We also have this survey. We want to get feedback from the crowd. So earlier, Chelsea Glauder put up that survey link. And we do ask if you could hit it and give us some input. We want to make this work for you, the audience. So I encourage you to be there, and I'll see you next Thursday night. Thank you. Anna, back to you.
Great. Thank you, everybody, and have a good night.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.